want to. Okay, so the topic of today is Yiddishism, the past and present of the Yiddishist movement. And this is a very nice title. Basically, what I would like to do is the very interesting and difficult task of defining what is Yiddishism, what is a Yiddishist, right? And the way I would like to do it is through a critical lens. So the first thing that I would like to say is I'm not looking for a single stable objective definition, but rather illuminating the changing semantics of this word Yiddishist and Yiddishism. I believe, and I will make the case, that when we say Yiddishism today, and when we said Yiddishism 100 years ago, we meant actually two completely different things. And I think that there's much to learn from differences. So this is the major frame of the talk today. But in order to really start, before I really start about the definitions and what it means and what it meant, and I will also bring some other people who define it, there is a certain introduction that needs to be made. So I assume that everybody here knows what Yiddish is. Otherwise, you will probably not come to the lecture. If this is not the case, you can write in the chat and I will make a short introduction. But I would like to make an introduction of the history of the Yiddish language, but not the one that you probably know, but an alternative introduction. In the sense, I would like to situate Yiddish historically in comparison to other vernacular languages. So Yiddish appears at about the year 1000. This is a bit mythological. It doesn't really matter because we don't really have text. We assume that it appears in Western Germany at the year 1000 as the vernacular of the Jewish population living along the Rhine River and later on emigrating towards southern Germany and from there to the east to the Slavic lands, so to say. And when we speak about the vernacular, in the case of Yiddish, it is very clear to what other language it is juxtaposed, being Hebrew, the sacred language, the written language, the language that is used not for everyday communication, but for certain situations, for example, reading portions of the Bible in the synagogue, but also for writing formal letters, for keeping the registers of the community, for engaging in conversation with other Jews who live in other lands who do not speak Yiddish. So Hebrew is a lingua franca of Jews, has been that way for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And Yiddish is the day-to-day language. And the time in which Yiddish becomes Yiddish and is separated from German is a very political question, a very difficult thing to put your finger on. But let's say that we don't problematize it at this point, and we agree that at some point Yiddish becomes distinct from German and is recognizable as a language in its own right, and its speakers, they have different names for it. Yiddish was actually a pretty new name. For example, one of the names that was used for Yiddish is Loshen Ashkenaz, the language of Ashkenaz. Yeah. Again, it can be problematized because Jews referred also to German as Loshen Ashkenaz, and it's not always very clear what is German and what is Yiddish. But let's say that at a certain point, let's call it 1500, okay? There is this is, of course, a very arbitrary statement. Let's say that about that time, Jews recognized that the language that they speak is different in German. It's their own vernacular language. But at this juncture, something very, very interesting happens. If we look at other literatures, other languages, Italian, German, English, French, we have about the same time also sort of a dichotomy between two kinds of languages. The Renaissance gave it a name, dead languages. This is the language of the Italian humanists who called Latin and Greek dead. And the vernacular, the languages that are presumably alive, be it Dante's or Petrarca's Italian, for example, okay? And you have this organic metaphor of life and death. where the living vernacular is being preferred. I think that something happened with Czech that is also similar, pretty much in the same time, more or less, right? A certain appropriation of the vernacular as a language that is capable, first of all, of translating the Bible, but also as a language that can produce a literature and a language that in some way expresses the spirit of, I don't want to say the nation because this is maybe a bit anachronistic, but this is the beginning maybe of proto-nationalism. And this happens in many different places in Europe. But here Yiddish and Hebrew are somehow playing the game differently. So before I explain in what way, I think you might know, but I will spell it out. It's important for me to criticize this paradigm, right? This is a very, 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 I think, a metaphor that went out of hand completely. This idea that there are dead languages and live languages that are alive. This, I don't think is true. I think that Latin was very much alive, for example, in those years, and was spoken in universities. And I think that Hebrew was very much alive. Or maybe we don't need life and death as a metaphor to refer to languages. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe we can just speak about people as living and dying, and languages as some kind of other structure that does not necessitate a moment of birth, life, and death. When we get to modernity and to this idea of the rebirth of Hebrew, and today in the 20th and 21st centuries, we always speak about the renaissance of Yiddish, which literally means rebirth, right? We see how the metaphor is actually not working, because if a language can be alive and then dead and then alive again, then maybe we need to find other terms for it. But nevertheless, these ideas, I think that stem from, I believe they stem from a trauma, from a European trauma of the plague, right? Which happened during the Renaissance, where about 2/3 of Europe was wiped out with plague. We see it all over in culture, representations of death, an obsession with death, and also this appellation of a language as a dead language and versus the vernacular that is alive is a product of this obsession, in my view, with death that is very characteristic of the time. So now we go to Hebrew and Yiddish. What is dead and what is alive? So we would assume that Hebrew should be considered the dead language of the Jews, which is maybe similar to Latin, whereas Yiddish is the vernacular, lively one. And if you look at cultural productions already around the year 1500, there is a vernacular production of literary works in Yiddish that is parallel to the production that we say in other languages, French, Italian, etc. But once we look at the ideologies attached to these languages, and we move a bit further to the next centuries, we see that the Jew, being at the end of the day a minority in Europe, and a minority on which the Christian mainstream society has projected a lot of fantasies, the Jew was both considered as having forgotten their original language. So Hebrew is dead, and this is maybe a fault of the Jews. And this is an idea that was shared by Christians and later by Jews also. So we have proto-Hebraism already in the 17th century, in the 18th century, Moses Mendelssohn, the beginning of the Haskalah, right? The Enlightenment movement, it speaks about the fact that Jews forgot their language. So it's dead, but it already has the potential of being remembered, so being reborn in a way. And Yiddish, and this is the interesting thing, was getting the role of a non-language, of a jargon. This is the term, the famous term that was used by Orientalist Christian scholars writing about the languages of Jews, and of course adopted famously adopted by Mendelssohn, who treated Yiddish as a language that has no merit, as a language that is a mix of languages. It is not really German, it is not really Hebrew, it's something in between. It's not a language, it's a jargon. It was a very pejorative term that was used by Mendelssohn to refer, let me remind you, to his own mother tongue. Okay, that was the language in which he was raised. And Yiddish, interestingly, became a language associated with precisely what limits Jews from full vernacular expression. So the ideals of the Haskalah, the ideals of the Enlightenment movement were for Jews to learn the vernacular of the majority culture. So Jews should learn German. And later, as the Haskalah, and I'm doing fast forward, moves to Galicia, and later it moves to Russia, and we have like the major blossoming of the Enlightenment, Jewish Enlightenment movement in the 19th century in Russia. You have the basis is to reject Yiddish as a language that bars Jews from fully integrating into the general society, and the language of the state is the preferred vernacular that would allow them to become modern subjects or to become full participants in the society. This is the dream, of course, the fantasy. We saw where this led, but okay, this is something else. And then Hebrew is cast as the dead language that we somehow needs to relearn. And let's say Russian or Polish or German or French for French Jews is the language that Jews should learn because that's the language of the majority culture. And then Yiddish somehow falls between the cracks. Yiddish does not have the same pathos that languages like Italian or French get, right? You don't have a continuous impetus of an ideological structure behind literary creation in Yiddish. What we would have thought as proto-Yiddishism, right, in the late modernity. We don't have it. What we do have is a realization that there is a gap between ideology and practice. Jews, for centuries, spoke Yiddish, and this was their language. And especially in Eastern Europe, it just didn't work, this ideological construct, this prescription that Jews should learn Hebrew and Russian. The masses spoke Yiddish. And the turn to Yiddish from the educated class, by the educated class, begins as a concession. So what we find are Maskilic writers, so enlightened writers, so people who are very much influenced, not just by Mendelssohn, but by a lot of, let's say, early modern thought. And they reject Yiddish ideologically, but they feel compelled to write in Yiddish in order to reach the masses. And you find a whole series of writers who write books in Yiddish, and they write in the introduction, usually in Hebrew, an apology, explaining why they write in Yiddish. They say, of course, this is a bad language, this is a jargon, it's part of the ghetto, we want to get rid of it, but this is the best way to convey ideas about education, about science, to the masses who do not speak another language. So we have a first generation, I'm talking about the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. In Germany, in Galicia, and in Russia, concurrently. We have the first wave, the first step of what will later become Yiddishism. It's the choice of using Yiddish, but still rejecting it. So you see there's a dialectics here. Yiddish is rejected ideologically and adopted as a means of mass communication. And we can say that the Yiddishist movement, now from historical point of view, I didn't get to definitions yet. This is like my overarching narrative. The turn is the moment in which these authors in Russia move from treating Yiddish as a mere instrument against Yiddish, as an instrument of enlightenment and education that would eventually replace Yiddish, to use Yiddish against Yiddish in a way. The moment in which they turn into affirming Yiddish as an expression of the folk, right? So this, in the same way that the brothers Grimm in Germany wrote a huge dictionary, but also collected folk tales, right? They did these two famous projects with the idea that the language is the expression of, it's the spirit of the folk. We have this same idea at the middle of the 19th century. Okay, in the middle of the 19th century, you have a moment which is a result of this dialectics, right? Yiddish was used as a means of communication, but then it gets affirmed as a true representation of the spirit of the nation, of the people. And this is a very gradual process. We find a lot of back and forths. So we find authors who write love poems to Yiddish, who speak of Yiddish as a language that is beautiful, and it's a field that has been abandoned, and we need to cultivate it and take all the bad grass, and all of these organic metaphors again from the Renaissance. You find them again and again, also in the 19th century. But then they apologize for using it, and they know it's not you find very often this metaphor. This is not the legal wife; it is the mistress, right? Yiddish is the mistress, but we love her nevertheless, right? So you have this apologetic stance vis-a-vis Yiddish. And at a certain point, before I move on, I can also name some names. Maybe it will be interesting for some of you. It's very important to say that this is something that happened in Italian 400 years before or 500 years before, right? So the same kind of affirmation of the vernacular, with this feeling that the Yiddish is not just a means of, it's not just this language spoken by the masses, but it's a language that imbues the spirit of the nation. This is something that happens extremely late, and it happens at the same time as another ideology becomes stronger and stronger, and this is the Hebraist movement. So at the same time that we have scholars opting for Hebrew to become the national language of the Jews, and think that it's not enough to be an intellectual and learn Hebrew just as a scholar, but you need to make the masses return to Hebrew. At the same time, you have a parallel development in Yiddish, where Yiddish is understood as the realistic choice, because Yiddish is anyway spoken by the masses. This is not artificial. We don't need to teach them Yiddish. They know Yiddish already. So instead of calling it jargon, we need to call it Yiddish. And this is already very important, because the word jargon was used still by Yiddish authors like Sholem Aleichem and Yudlamet Peretz. They used the word jargon because they didn't really have another word. And this rejection of the word jargon and adoption of the word Yiddish as a positive name for the same language is something that we see. It's a process again that really, I would say, ends in 1908. This is a very arbitrary, maybe an artificial date, but a very important date for the Yiddishist movement. Something very important happened in that year, which I will explain in a second. But I just want to finish the sentence saying that from this point on, to call the language jargon would immediately position you politically. It means that you are against it. And to call it Yiddish would more or less convey to the listener that you are, in a way, a supporter of the language. So already the name of the language and calling it Yiddish becomes so politicized at the beginning of the 20th century that we can say, who is a Yiddishist? A Yiddishist is a person who calls the language Yiddish. This is a first definition. Yeah, I did the work. I looked at texts, I looked at articles, I read books, and looked for the word Yiddishist and where does it appear. And one of its usages, these early usages of the word, is, I think, it can be defended that the definition is a person who calls the language Yiddish, which is a political statement because it's affirmative. What happened in 1908? 1908, in the city of Chernovitz, which is today Ukraine, was a language conference took place by very, very motivated activists of Yiddish who debated the different needs of the language and already affirmed how important Yiddish is for the Jewish people and how important it is to recognize it as a full-fledged language and not as a dialect, etc. And there was a very big debate as to the question whether Yiddish is the national language of the Jews or a national language of the Jews. You see, already in this context, in the Yiddish language conference, the debate was, are we going to use the restrictive definite article, which means that Yiddish is par excellence the national language of the Jews, or, and this was eventually the case, remain with the declaration, no, Yiddish is a national language of the Jews, which was revolutionary, but also you see the concession. It is a national language of the Jews, taking into account, of course, that Hebrew is also a national language of the Jews, right? It was mainly Yulam Peretz, a great writer and intellectual and classic of Yiddish literature, who said, no, friends, you cannot say that Yiddish is the national language of the Jews because that would be rejecting Hebrew, and this is turning against your own Judaism. You cannot do that, right? So we have this tension between Hebrew and Yiddish, even within the most Yiddishist of bastions, which was in 1908, the city of Chernovitz, where you had a conglomeration of all, like really the most ardent proponents of Yiddish met there to discuss the language and what it needs and how to develop it further. And you find the word Yiddishist there. You find the word Yiddishist in the protocols of the conference, and you find it in the press that was covering the conference. And it is always difficult to say if Yiddishist is ironic or not. Is it a pathological term? Like, a Yiddishist, right? A person who believes in Yiddish. Could be that it had this connotation and then got reappropriated by Yiddishists. Yes, we are Yiddishists. Yeah, we are those whom you joke of, right? You think we are those fanatics of this lousy language. Yes, we take that epithet and we call ourselves Yiddishists, right? So it's very important that when we look in those years, the stocks of the value of the stock Yiddish were so low, and the fight was really for recognition, that you really you need to put this into account when you try to understand what the word meant, right? Today we say Yiddishist, we come to it with a neutral perspective. Back then, when the word Yiddishist was uttered, there was already tension in the room, right? There was either we are mocking somebody or we are affirming something that is provocative. But let us go a bit backwards again before I move on, because there's another definition of Yiddishist that appears before 1908. It appears as early as the 70s of the 19th century, but it is not called Yiddishist. It is called jargonist. I took the labor of looking in the Yiddish press what was the usage of the name of the word jargonist. And jargonist, interestingly, is a writer of jargon. So all of the writers who wrote in Yiddish, when I say Yiddish and jargon, I mean the same language, just to be clear, yeah? They call themselves jargonisten at the time. All the writers, all of them, at the 19th century, knew perfect Hebrew. There is no example of a single writer who did not know Hebrew. And the great majority started in Hebrew, or at least published some in Hebrew. And Hebrew and Yiddish, or jargon, were the two choices that an author could make. There were more, right? You could also publish in Russian or in Polish. I'm speaking about the major communities where Yiddish was spoken. But let's say this choice between Yiddish and Hebrew, for many, many, many authors, they chose both. The most famous example is of Mendele Moicher Sforim, which is the pen name of Sholem Yankin Abramovich, also termed the father of Yiddish literature, also termed the father of Hebrew literature, or the grandfather. Usually it's called the grandfather. And he said, really, he's like the Goethe. I don't know, maybe there's a more Jan Hus, I don't know, a better check. Who's Goethe for Czech? Okay, whatever. He was the Goethe of both. Who? What? Joe?
There is no single Goethe for the Czech language.
There is no Chapek. No. Okay.
That's somewhere between Hus and Macha, maybe.
Okay. No, but really, he's considered. Of course, it's a myth. I mean, of course, it's a pedestal. It's as always with canon, but he's considered as the grandfather of both literatures, which is astonishing. Mendele, yeah, and Mendele is famously quoted to have said, this question, what language should I choose, is completely ridiculous. Hebrew or Yiddish. It's like asking me, from which nostril should I breathe? I have two, and I need to breathe from both, right? Again, an organic metaphor, an organic image, yeah, but with a lot of humor and not and a bit surprising. But this was very, very true to many, many authors who chose both. And the word jargonist means or meant since the 70s of the 19th century, a person who chose to write in Yiddish. The choice to write in Yiddish was in itself very provocative. Many people thought they were going to lose their careers. It's like publishing a poem about Gaza. Yeah, I mean, mutatis mutandis. But true, to write in Yiddish in the 19th century for many meant renouncing a career as a serious author, like to write belettre, to write poems or prose in Yiddish. Okay, so you write to the masses, so you're not a serious author. That's why we have a huge amount of authors who use pseudonyms, right? Did you think of why Sholem Aleichem or Mendele Moicher Sforim, all of these people have pseudonyms, right? They have pseudonyms also. I'm not sure how many people in this audience know those references, but a pseudonym was a way to secure your role as an author in Hebrew. Because worst case scenario, you can always, change from one persona to another. You can distance yourself from your writings in Yiddish. And a jargonist is, interestingly, you find it means a Yiddish author. But a Yiddish author, it's already an ideological choice. A person who chooses Yiddish as a form of expression is already an ideological choice. And this is what I'm trying to show you, and we will see later modern examples of the usage of the term. There's always tension, whether the term signifies something objective or an ideological stance. And we will see it. Actually, we can jump right into it. Let me just finish the overview of the pre-war to say that Yiddish gained became so trendy in political and social Yiddish Jewish movements. It was the major language of the Bund, the most important political party of Jews before the Second World War. It was a part of unbelievable blossoming of Yiddish schools that started in Eastern Europe and then all around the world where there was Jewish immigration, Ashkenazi immigration. You find Yiddish schools. It's part of this Yiddishist movement. And basically, Yiddishism as a movement was much more important than Hebraism before the Second World War. Yeah, I want to jump right to the present, but I want to say something about Hebraism, which also has a very interesting tension. It will help us. Yeah, it will help us reach the present day. So in the Yiddish dictionary, the one that was written by Yitzhak Nibosky, there is a distinction between two terms. Let me show it to you. I share my screen. This is the first term. Can you see it? Hebraist. Hebraist. Hebraist is a Hebrew scholar, generally non-Jewish. Hebraist, right? So a Christian scholar who studies Hebrew. Mainly Protestant scholars studied Hebrew. We have, it's similar to Orientalist, right? The person who studies languages of the East, and we have them in the 16th century, 17th century, 19th century, Hebraisten. And here's another one, Hebraist. Hebraist. Right, you don't really read Hebrew letters maybe, so I'll have to spell it out for you. That the first one was Hebraist, probably coming from Hebraicum in Latin. Whereas the second, Hebraist, probably comes from Hebräisch, which is the Yiddish or German word for Hebrew. And Hebraist is a proponent of the dissemination of Hebrew as a spoken language of all Jews. So again, there's a distinction, a huge distinction. And of course, if you look at the corpus of Yiddish text, you will see that it's not 100% like this, but yeah, it's true. Usually we would write Hebraist when you refer to the ideology of those who believe that Hebrew should be the language of the Jews, whereas Hebraist usually refers to mostly Protestant scholars of Hebrew. So where is Yiddishist in this paradigm, right? What is the antonym of Yiddishist? Is it Hebraist or Hebraist, right? So until now, we could say that Yiddishist is obviously the antonym of Hebraist, right? A Hebraist believes that Hebrew should be the language of all Jews, and Yiddishist believes that Yiddish is the language that should be chosen as the national language, right? But now we're making, okay, let's do a pause. In between, we have the genocide, right? Everything is over. Everything, all the dreams are over. All the dreams of having a blossoming Yiddish culture in Europe completely decimated by the Nazi genocide. Completely decimated. And this idea that Yiddish is a language that will unite the Jewish diaspora becomes a fantasy, becomes a hollow fantasy if we see the post-traumatic reactions of the Jewish communities in the major lines of its immigration. So in the United States, Yiddish is being rapidly replaced by English. Yiddish becomes a language of those words that that you speak in the East Coast or the West Coast, those Yiddish words that have entered English. But other than that, we have a generation, very, very soon a generation that does not speak Yiddish, is not interested in Yiddish. It is a newer phenomenon. American Jews who go back to their roots and are interested in Yiddish. Soviet Union had a very blossoming Yiddish culture that was funded by the state until it got decimated by Stalin. 1952, the Nights of the Dead, of the Murdered Poets, all the intelligentsia, the most important Jewish authors were killed that night. And since then, of course, Yiddish continued. There was always something published in Yiddish, but this open-armed funding and the possibility of Yiddish as a minority language next to other minorities in the Soviet Union, that got cleared away. State of Israel. State of Israel is only rivaled by the Soviet Union in its antagonism to Yiddish. In certain ways, it even gave less rights to Yiddish. The fight for Hebrew was fundamentally based on the rejection of Yiddish. The entire project, the Zionist project of the State of Israel, is based on the idea of creating a new Jew, a Hebrew Jew, a Jew that would go away from its diasporic roots, change their family names, and change the language. And of course, there were other languages as well. There were Polish and Hungarian and Arabic, but most of the immigrants, the Jewish immigrants who come to Palestine, spoke Yiddish, and this was the number one enemy of the Hebrew culture. France, after the war, most Jews who remained in Europe found themselves in France, either from before the war or just they emigrated after the war to France. This has, until today, it's the biggest Jewish community in Europe and the third largest community in the world. So after the United States, State of Israel, we have France as number 3. And the entry ticket to French society was not just learning French, but forgetting Yiddish. In the Paris Yiddish Center, I have lots of students whose first language was Yiddish. They actively repressed it, either with or without the consent of their parents or motivation by their parents. And at the age of 60, they come back and say, we want to relearn the language that we suppressed. And you have very similar social phenomena in the United States and in the State of Israel. So this entire Yiddishist dream of before the war collapses and crumbles. 5 of the 6 million Jews who were killed by the Nazis spoke Yiddish. And those who didn't, those who survived or those who lived in other countries were subject to a very, very rapid process of assimilation, linguistic assimilation, more than any other kind of assimilation. And we found ourselves today in a situation in which Yiddish is spoken by maybe 1 million, maybe even more, Orthodox Hasidic Jews who don't want to hear anything about Yiddishism. There's no room for a secular ideology, although they do, I think, very much are. They are Yiddishists in the sense that they see Yiddish as an instrument of retaining their own identity, and they fight for their children to speak Yiddish, and they speak Yiddish at home, and they create in Yiddish, but they wouldn't call it Yiddishism. They would call it Judaism, right? They speak Yiddish organically, if you like. There is no secular ideology here. And those secular Jews who speak Yiddish today, people like myself who learned it, people like Joe here who also learned it, or Matei here, this you can put them really in a big stadium. Very, very little. They cannot speak of a Yiddishist movement. And then comes the question, so what is a Yiddishist? And we're going back to first, let's hear other people. not just my own voice. I brought a couple of clips from the Wexler Oral History Project of the National Book Center. This is a very large Yiddish center in the United States, in Amherst, Massachusetts. And they conducted interviews with hundreds of people, both Yiddishist activists like myself, but also with survivors, with people who have interesting stories to tell, with professors, with many different people. And like 2-hour interviews, all of them are free to watch. And I searched the database and look for some definitions and some answers to the question of what is Yiddishism and what is Yiddish. And I would like to share them with you and problematize them with you. But first, before we move to the first one, I want to come back to this dichotomy, Hebraist, and to point out that something happened with the word Yiddishist that was permitted also because of the way in which the word is constructed. Think of words like Germanist, right? Germanist is a scholar of German. And Yiddishist, maybe it's also a scholar of Yiddish. In German, we say Yiddistic. Yiddistic is the field of Yiddish studies. So what is one scholar of the field of Yiddistic? A Yiddist. So a Yiddishist, if you want. Yeah. And this is the first person that we're going to listen to and see what he means when he says Yiddishist. Okay? So Jean Baumgarten is scholar of medieval and early modern Yiddish. He was born in Paris, 1950, grew up in Paris. He works in Paris. He's a researcher in a university in Paris. And he is answering to the question, are you a Yiddishist? Okay? And when you listen to him, look for tensions, look for difficulties. Yeah, what disturbs Jean Baumgarten, and why does he hesitate so much in his answer? Okay.
Would you define yourself as a Yiddishist?
I am not ideologist. I am not, and also I like to insert Yiddish in a whole context and in the global context. So you have to see all the dimension and the comparative and the parallel dimension of. For example, I am working on the early modern period, so it's important to see the porosity, the relation, the links between the non-Jewish society and the Jewish society, and so if I mean Yiddish is not enough by itself. You have to combine with Hebrew, and you also have to have a broader perspective. So I am a Yiddishist if it's this large perspective, but I am not a Yiddishist. It's only an ideological way to think that Yiddish in itself is everything. So I don't know if I answer, but I will say yes and no.
Okay, yes and no. And as you can see, he's basically answering to two different questions at the same time. That, I think, explains his difficulty in answering. He's answering to the question, are you a Yiddishist in the sense of a scholar of Yiddish? Well, yes. But are you a Yiddishist in the sense of an ideologist, a person who believes in the dissemination of Yiddish, who fights for Yiddish? No. But okay, but this is more complicated than that. Because once he answers as a scholar, Says, well, I'm not an ideologist, but as a scholar, well, also here, not just Yiddish. I look for relations with other languages in other contexts. So he's also there, he's being apologetic in a place where a Germanist, for example, would not be apologetic, right? If you ask a scholar of German, are you a Germanist? They would say yes. They wouldn't say, wait a second, I'm looking in, I don't know, not just German, also other. Right? So this reflex, this apologetic reflex, in a way, comes from the dual definition of what is a Yiddishist. And at the very end, I find when he says, yes, I am, no, yes and no, in a way, he's at the same time trying not to alienate the academic public who might watch the video, right? He's a serious scholar. He's not a Yiddishist. He's a serious scholar. He's a scholar of Yiddish. He's not an ideologist. Okay, but he doesn't want to alienate the Yiddishists either, because he's talking to the Wexler Oral History Project of the Yiddish Book Center, and he knows that the people who are going to watch this video many of them believe in Yiddish from the bottom of their heart, right? They are sentimental activists, and in a way, he doesn't want to exclude himself from the group completely. And we are left with a definition of Yiddish that is not very, very clear. Let's move on to the next. And if you have questions or remarks, you are very much welcome. The next is Paul Glasser, who is a scholar of Yiddish, researcher, teacher, and also he still writes a column at the Yiddish Forwards, the Yiddish newspaper. I've read him many, many times. Here it is. And he's answering a slightly different question. He's answering the question, can you be a Yiddishist without teaching your kids Yiddish?
Und sie kann sein, ein Yiddishist und zu lernen Yiddish zu den Kindern?
Das ist die Sache. Wir haben gehabt so viele Yiddishisten, was haben gepredigt Yiddishism, aber nicht geredet in Yiddish mit den Kindern, aber haben sie nicht gewollt, oder haben sie gehalten, es ist zu schwer. Du weißt, dass man kann ja sein Yiddishist, aber es ist etwas Puster Yiddishism, es geht nicht darüber von dort zu dort. Und mein Lehrer Blank hat mir erzählt, und das habe ich dann auch gehört von anderen euch, als genug Redaktoren von jüdischen Zeitungen haben nicht gewollt, man soll sie jaschenen. Hat sich, ich denke nicht, wenn man hat zitiert, hat gesagt, ihr wird uns nicht jaschenen. Und Avram Sutzgeber mit meinem ganzen der Cheretz, als hat beschlossen, als kein mehr nicht herausgeben die goldene Kate, hat sie vermacht. Aber was hat nicht da weggegeben? Ich weiß, an Noverstern, sie an anderen, was wollte es gekannt weiterführen? Von Jüngeren da. Aber was hat es gemusst untergehen mit ihm? Aber ich kann sicher nicht sagen, als Sutzgeber ist nicht kein Yiddishist. Er hat doch so viel getan für Jiddisch von seinem Ankommen in Israel, im Meschach von 60 Jahren. Aber das nicht wollen, als der Junge da soll herrschen, das ist nicht zu verstehen. Aber es ist eher eine versprechende Sache bei Yiddishisten. Ist der für ja, aber was für ein Tam hat das Yiddishism, was will nicht, dass der Junge da soll herrschen. Und es ist eine traurige Sache bei uns.
Okay. I hope that you were able to follow the subtitles. In case was it readable? Good. Yeah, first of all, very interesting. The question is already very ideological. right? Sounds like a rhetorical question. Do you think you can be a true Yiddishist without teaching your children Yiddish? And we expect that he will say no, but he says yes. And this is, first of all, it's an expression of this expectation of Yiddishism as a movement that fosters a continuity, an image of an organic continuity. We go back to those organic metaphors that I rejected in the beginning of the talk, that a live language is something that is, that is like an organic thing, that it is alive, or the nostrils of Mendele, right? That Yiddish is truly alive if it goes from parents to children and from them to their children. And this is, of course, in the core of the national imagination, the core of this idea of continuity, that we speak the language that was spoken by our parents and they speak the language that's spoken by their parents. Well, for many, many people, it's not the case, right? I did not grow up in the language. I was not born in the language, in the place that my parents were born, and they were not born in the country where their parents were born. I'm third generation of migration. But the national imagination imagines us growing up in the same place as our parents, speaking the same language as our parents, and imagines a continuity. And this idea, is the Yiddishist movement a movement that would like to have for Jews the same continuity as other languages, as other other cases. And then you see how this question is completely different if you ask it 100 years ago or today. Because 100 years ago, no Jews would think that it is a problematic thing. What language do I speak with my children? I can be a Yiddishist and not speak Yiddish to my children. Yud Lamed Peretz, that I mentioned before, was a very great and ardent supporter of Yiddish, but he spoke Polish to his child. For him, it was the most natural thing in the world. At home, he spoke Polish. Shalom Aleichem spoke Russian to his children. And not just the editors of newspapers in the United States after the war, already in the 19th century. And I think that today, after the genocide, today in a time where the trauma of the great break in Yiddish history, Jewish history, these questions of continuity have this, they weigh in a different way. And you see that at the end of the day, you must concede and say, yes, you can be a Yiddishist and not speak Yiddish to your children. Which I find, again, very, very interesting, that the tension is part of the definition. In other words, there is a tradition of broken tradition by Jews. This idea that tradition is constantly broken and has been broken. And you find it all the time, even in the, by Maimonides, by in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, you find all the time this idea that you have like a linear progression of tradition, and then it was cut, and then it was forgotten, and then we had to come back, and Moses knew everything, and then he died, and then Joshua came, and he knew some of it, right? You have this idea of broken tradition as a very, very, very crucial aspect of Jewish self-understanding. And I think that here you have the same thing. I was interviewed just now for the German radio, and they wanted to make an interview about Yiddish, about Yiddishism, actually. Asked me about what is my definition of Yiddishism. And at the end of the interview, asked me, and what do you think about the fact that so little families of Yiddishists speak Yiddish to their children? Only a handful. And how do you reckon? What should we do about that? And I problematized the premise of the question. Why should we care? Why is it so important? Why is it the only way in which a language can exist? He says, Paul Glasser, a puster Yiddishism, an empty Yiddishism. Why is it empty? It is empty because it imagines a mode of dissemination of the language that is not through kinship. It makes it empty. I learned it from teachers, and I might teach you Yiddish one day, and you will teach others, right? This is also a way of disseminating a language, don't you think? So this organic idea comes to articulation by the next speaker that I would like to present to you. This is Beile Schechter-Gottesman, quite a famous poet, an educator. She died a couple of years ago. She was born in Vienna in 1920, and she belongs to a very famous Yiddishist family in the United States, where it is known that everybody speaks Yiddish there. So all the cousins and the uncles, it's like a very small clan, but they all speak Yiddish. And she speaks about that. She answers also the question about Yiddishism and what Yiddishism means to her. And look, she also contrasts it to other conceptions of Yiddishism. They all problematize it in some way, which I find very productive. So here we go.
Sie könnt uns erklären, was meint Yiddishism zu euch?
Ich weiß, ja, Yiddishism meint für Menschen eine neue Welt, ein neuer Aspekt. Für mich ist Yiddishism ein Lebensstege. Ich bin eine Tochter von einer heißen Yiddishist und also bin ich, also wie gehe noch, auch mein Bruder und mein Bruder. Mir, das heißt Yiddishism, sehr heiße Chassidim von Umgehen in Jiddisch, von Leben in Jiddisch, sich ausleben in Jiddisch. Unsere Kinder, unsere Enkel, unsere ganze Mischproche geht auf die Wege. Bewusstsinnige Erziehung in Mamschig sein, in der Sprache, in der Kultur. Und es ist unsere Kultur. Es ist unsere Welt, eine Welt für sich. Ja, es ist nicht Jewish, es ist Jiddisch.
Yeah, so I think that what Beile Schechter-Gottesman does is she problematizes the question in the sense that she shows that the very question is questioning the existence of Yiddish as a fully fledged identity, right? What is Yiddishism for you? No, she doesn't accept it. She's not, we're not like people like myself who learned Yiddish one day and became part of this club, a bit like Esperanto, right? We travel around the world and we speak to other people who speak Yiddish, and we go to summer universities and we teach it and we learn it and we write it and we translate it and we really love it. No. I am 100% embedded in Yiddish. It's in my veins. So basically she's creating a picture, a vivid picture of an organic life in Yiddish, which is the strongest ideological marker. Instead of saying what needs to be done, she says, this is my life, this is our life. And of course, it's one family. Yeah, so I find it very interesting to see how very often when people ask about Yiddishism, we find the questions of an organic existence being either questions or reaffirmed. I truly think that this has to do with the Churban, with the genocide, with the fact that it is not entirely clear what kind of future Yiddish has, and it's a reaction. It's a post-traumatic reaction to the break. Now let me show you one more, and then I'll have a short concluding remark, and then we can open for discussion. So the last person, I just find it great because she's not problematizing anything. You will see yourself. That's Anna Hane Aikin Moss, who is scholar of, she's a professor of Slavic studies and Yiddish. I think now she's in Chicago University, if I'm not mistaken. Back then, I'm not sure where she was. The interview was done in 2019, also in Yiddish. And that will be the last interview we will see together, okay?
Sie wollte sich allein gerufen naar Yiddishist?
Oh, sicher. Ja, ich meine, das ist das einzige Wort, was Tage bedeckt, was genug klar und offen bedeckt, die alle Teilen von meinem Leben. Und ja, ich meine, das ist sicher der richtige Wort. Und das einzige Wort. Es ist nicht nur, was ich rede Jiddisch in der Heim. Ich bin nicht nur ein Jiddisch Redder, aber ich tue es bewusstsinnig mit einer gewissen Ideologie, mit ein bisschen mit der Sachwillen und Sacharbeit. Und es erklärt, es geht über die Arbeit, was man legt rein in dem.
So what is it? It is not just the fact that she speaks it at home. No, it's an engagement. And it is 100% her identity. And I think that now comes the question, engage in what? Engage for what? We are no longer in the time where Yiddish is the language of the Jewish working class. And the fight for recognizing Yiddish is the fight for recognizing a language of a very, very large working class. And the fight for founding new Yiddish schools is the fight for the education of the Jewish people, right? That was the case. When people fought for Yiddish, they fought for the language that happened to be the language of the of about 95% of the Jews before the war. I think of Vladimir Medem. Vladimir Medem, who gave his name, the library, Medem Library is named after him, the institution that I direct in Paris. Vladimir Medem is a very interesting example. He was the main theoretician of the Bund movement, a very, very sharp Marxist. And he wrote, I think that Joe worked a bit on Medem's work. I think we spoke about it a bit. And he of course, he fought for Yiddish as an articulation not as an articulation, as simply the language of the Jewish working class. He fought for Yiddish rights. He fought also for the creation of Yiddish schools in Russia. And his mother tongue was Russian. He learned Yiddish as an adult in order to speak the language of the Jewish masses. And he did not believe that Yiddish has anything intrinsically important. It just happened to be the language of the group that he represented. And he did not think the Jews have anything in itself that is more important or more particular or interesting than others. He just happened to be Jewish, so he fought for rights of Jews, but he was extremely skeptical about any kind of nationalism. He wrote in his famous monograph about the social democracy and nationalism, he asked, what should be our position towards nationalism? And at the end of the day, he says, neutral. He understands that nationalism is a vehicle for liberation of the working class, but it cannot be an end in itself. If it is an end in itself, it is fetishism. It is bourgeois fetishism. So his position vis-a-vis vis-a-vis nationalism was neutral. And for years, that was the position of the Bund movement until famously in 1912, it was rejected. And the Bund said, no, we are not neutral vis-a-vis the national question. We are Jewish nationalists. Of course, it's not a territorial nationalism. It is not a nationalism that demands the creation of a state. It is a diasporic nationalism that we fight for rights, our rights and the rights of our peers everywhere we are in the world. But it still is embedded in Jewish nationalism. And that was the position of the Bund since 1912 until today. And Vladimir Medem had to accept it. Although he was alive and it was not his position, he had to accept it. What would Vladimir Medem say today about people like myself? About the Paris Yiddish Center? About summer universities where Yiddish is taught? He would most probably say, this is a fetish, a bourgeois fetish that has absolutely no vital necessity in the world of the working class. There is no Yiddish-speaking working class, and what we are doing is sentimentality. And I accept that. I am a Yiddishist, and I am trying to be very, very, very honest with you. I think that there is something about Yiddishism that is a lost cause. By definition, it's lost. It has already lost many years ago. And I do not believe that if I start to speak Yiddish to my son, and if I convince him to speak Yiddish to his children, someday Yiddish would become the language of millions again. I do not believe that. And this is not the reason why I learned Yiddish, and this is not the reason why I call myself Yiddishist. But I do believe that this lost cause, this idea, this anti-ideology, or this ideology of an anti-movement, or not an anti-movement, a movement that cannot win, a movement that lost, has a very, very great deal of power. The fact that I think it is part of what is so attractive by this field of concepts that we throw to the air all the time, right? Diasporism, marginality, minority, lost cause, non-territoriality, non-sovereignty, right? This idea that we learn a language, we go to summer schools, we teach it, we write articles. I wrote a poem in Yiddish in this language that represents so much history, but has absolutely lost any kind of stake at becoming a national language. The Chernovitz conference is irrelevant today, in the sense that it will never become the language or a national language of the Jews. Even if 5 million Orthodox Jews will speak it, I don't think that Yiddish's future is in the masses. Yiddish's future is in its relationship to the treasures that have been created in it. And it is a unique identity marker in the present. And I think that the last speaker that I showed you is a very good example for it. This is an identity, a very soft identity that can be shared. Well, I only showed you Jews, but there are many, many non-Jews who also consider themselves Yiddishists, who also participate in this society of people who engage in Yiddish, both as learners, also as teachers, as cultural activists. And these objectives that we find in old usage of the word Yiddishist, right? This objective of making Yiddish the language of the Jews. These objectives, if you still believe in them, then in a way, yeah, you're detached from reality. And this is not a wake-up call. It's an attempt to redefine what is nevertheless so appealing about Yiddishism. And I think that it is precisely a way to engage with diasporism, to engage with a non-violent notion of nationalism, a nationalism that is soft and open and not necessarily exclusive, right? Yiddishism, this is one point that I'm making very, very often when I speak to people about languages and identity. Language is one of the identity markers that is not excluding others. So if we think of other identity markers like gender or age or nationality or race, right? We cannot be both white and black, or we cannot. Maybe we can, but so it will be. You cannot be white and black, right? And you cannot be both queer and straight. You cannot. You can say that, but okay, so you're queer, right? Or you cannot be Muslim and Jewish. You can say that, but people will never give credit to this choice. But when you say your life is in Yiddish, there's nothing that prevents you to have your life in Italian at the same time. Nothing prevents you from picking up Mandarin or Russian, right? There's nothing excluding about languages. And I think that there is a certain definition of Yiddishism that I embody in a sense as a cultural activist, as a linguistic activist, as a person who organizes summer programs for Yiddish, where people can be Yiddishist, can be part of this world, only if they learn the language, if they engage in the language, and then it just doesn't matter. Neither their religion, nor their ethnicity, nor the political views, or the geography. It's just the language that combines them together in a way that does not exclude. I mean, there is an exclusion. People who do not know Yiddish cannot really be Yiddishist, but the door is open by definition. And I think that this is what is very, very special for linguistic identities. And I think that this might be the reason why there are very many people, young people in Europe, not Jews, who are interested in Yiddish, because it gives, or in the Yiddishist scene, because it gives them certain answers to questions that they cannot get answered by other identity concepts today, right? I think in a way, Yiddishism is an antidote to the rampant extreme right and xenophobia and racism that was on the rise. I think that Yiddish and Yiddishism will be even more a sanctuary, both in terms of individual identity, but also conceptually and philosophically, a sanctuary in very, very, very hard times that are unfortunately unfolding today. I wouldn't say in Europe, because that would be not true, in the entire West, and maybe even beyond. Okay, this was my talk, and I'm very, very grateful for you having listened till the end.